Welcome to Beyond the Medical Algorithm, a podcast by the Philly Wellness Center. Join us on a journey through the too often neglected path to wellness, where we celebrate the human body and all things natural to illuminate new roads to health and happiness. Holistic is the name of the game, and I'll be talking to fellow experts and enthusiasts to rejoice in healing and revolutionize the way we approach therapy. I'm your host, Catie Harris. In today's episode of Beyond the Medical Algorithm, we welcome Dr. Marc Hauser, a neuroscientist and former Harvard professor who founded Risk Eraser. Marc has dedicated his career to studying childhood trauma and resilience, and his latest book, Vulnerable Minds: The Harm of Childhood Trauma and the Hope of Resilience, offers new strategies for supporting children facing adversity. Today, he'll share how his interdisciplinary approach can transform child development and holistic wellness. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you very much, Catie. Nice to be here.
So could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to explore this particular area of neurobiology and education?
Yeah, I think the main inspiration was working, especially in schools, both in the United States and in programs actually abroad in Kenya, for example, where we're doing a lot of work in mental health issues for children, for example, orphans who are living in children's homes or orphanages, and then all the children I work with in the United States who most commonly are in schools for children with different kinds of disabilities, especially emotion and behavioral disabilities. And many of those are children who are living with various traumatic experiences. And the motivation for the book was really that many of the people working with such children, including parents, are often not aware of the quite rich scientific evidence that has accumulated over decades now, that is tucked away in academic journals and is often not either accessible or there's not awareness from the practitioners. And that includes doctors, nurses, social workers, counselors, clinicians, therapists, law enforcement in some cases, all people who really need to understand what happens when children experience adversity, and importantly, what can be done to help. So I tried to write the book with that kind of very, very broad audience in mind, which is not easy. Authors often have to try to pick an audience rather than to speak to all. But I wanted to be accessible and useful in terms of both understanding the significance of the impact of childhood adversity on children, importantly, the global nature of it. So this was really written with a very, very broad global audience in mind. It wasn't just for Americans, people in Massachusetts, where I live. So that was really the motivation, was to really provide people with both the understanding and strategies to help children build resilience and recover.
Yeah, and I can attest to that as well. As a nurse practitioner, I went through my program in the early 2000s. And I mean, you talk about the ACEs, and that was not taught at that time. So there's like a whole generation of us that had no idea. It came up years later, and it was just kind of like, oh, what's this? And here it is embedded in science for decades. And to get it to the classroom and to the providers, it's alarming, how long it takes.
It is alarming. And I think the other piece of it too is that even when, let's say in your discipline, in nursing and medicine, when there is awareness of ACEs, there's a lot of confusion around what ACEs are and how to think about them and their implications for mental and physical health. And so I think part of it was also to both flag the significance of kind of the evidence around ACEs, but also clarify some of the confusions and the ways in which the sciences have really gone far beyond the original kind of presentation of that work, which is the late 90s. The sciences have gone well beyond what those original reports were about. So that's an important piece too. And in part because the work on ACEs has made its way into policy. And in some cases, I think the policy implications have been dangerous, actually. I think they've been misinterpreted or overinterpreted. So we can maybe get into that a little bit as well.
I'd love to hear an example. But first, just for the audience, could you just describe what ACEs are? And in your book, I have your book. I read your book and really appreciate this because you break the ACEs down into 5 elements as well. So what the ACEs are and then how you break them down.
Yeah, so the acronym stands for, of course, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I think it's really important for the listeners today to take note of those three words. What's adversity? What's childhood? And what's an experience? And all three of those kind of need to be unpacked if we're going to make sense of what's going on. So, in the original wording of this by Dr. Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda, who were the key medical practitioners who really uncovered the idea and presented it, adversity wasn't really kind of operationally defined. It was really just things that are seen to be kind of bad for children. And in the original incarnation, it was all the things that happened kind of within the family environment. So, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, physical neglect, and then kind of a broad category of what was called family dysfunction, things like divorce, separation, incarceration of a parent, mental health of a parent. So those were kind of the types of adversity, but it wasn't like they were coming out of the literature that sort of defined them in one ways. But they were clearly things that were seen as beyond the norm. Childhood was defined as anything individual below the age of 18, so birth to 18. And I think that's an important piece because that's a very obviously long swath of time where lots of things are developing between birth and 18, but that's how they define childhood. And then experience was simply just whatever the experience was. That's important in particular because people have often confused ACEs with the response to adversity, and that's a deep mistake. The ACEs are really the experience. It's what do you experience? How you respond may be with trauma or it may be resilient. And we need to understand both. So for the listeners today, just put in your head a kind of a scale or spectrum that runs from vulnerable to resilience. The experiences are going to move you somewhere along that dimension, but your of course your biology is going to initially place you somewhere on that spectrum from vulnerable to resilient. So the ACEs were really kind of hit the international scene because the original report indicated that individuals with more ACEs, in this case, more different types of adverse childhood experiences, were associated with much greater health risks, both in terms of physical health, things like obesity, liver disease, cancer, and mental health, depression, anxiety, and many other things. So that's what really put the ACEs on the table. And the World Health Organization was very quickly aware of this result in 1998. And very quickly, the questionnaire was disseminated across the world to the point where now we have the World Health Organization reporting, this was as late as I think 2022, that 1 billion children each year across the world are maltreated. That's just a staggering number when you think of 8 billion people in the world, 1 billion children are maltreated. So that was a very important kind of wake up call in some ways that doctors who Felitti himself never necessarily bothered to ask whether certain kinds of physical and mental health diseases may be due in part to adverse childhood experiences. This was kind of a wake up call for many in the medical world to ask about that because they may be key causes.
And to say like 1 billion children maltreated, that scope is so overwhelming. It almost feels hopeless.
It almost feels hopeless. And of course, what I do in the book is I remind people by giving them examples, personal examples of children I've worked with, and I'm sure we'll get to this, which where there is hope. But one of the things related to your second part of your question is that we need to look beyond just the type of adversity and the number of ACEs to what I call the adverse T's, the letter T. And there are 5 different dimensions of adversity that I think are fundamental to understanding what may happen in terms of individuals' responses to adversity. So the first we've already talked about, which is type. And the typology has grown beyond the original set by recognizing that a lot of adversity happens outside of the family. So, bullying, discrimination, oppression, poverty, war, community violence are all things that are outside of the family but can greatly impact children, as we, of course, are witnessing today in Ukraine and Gaza. Millions of children being affected by the war there. So, type is a much broader than the original sense. Second T is timing. When during development did it occur? And here, what I want to alert the listeners to is there are three important additional dimensions to timing that we need to take into account. The first is prenatally. For Felitti and colleagues in the original ACEs, it was postnatal. But we know that the stress that a mother undergoes during pregnancy can directly affect fetal development through all the hormonal physiological changes that happen. And we know those have tremendous impact on mental and physical health when the child is born. So first is prenatal. The second is extending beyond 18 because we know that the frontal lobes of the brain, the sort of the seat of what's often called our executive functions, mature up until about 23 to 25 years of age. So post college for many kids who go to college. So that maturational period is slow. It takes a long time to develop. And that's the seat of things like attention, short term working memory, planning, self regulation. All those are kind of in some ways housed, at least in the core sense, in the frontal area, which is going to develop until 23, 25. The third dimension of timing is that even that period from birth to 18 is filled with different critical or sensitive periods. These are windows of opportunity where if certain kinds of experiences don't occur, or bad experiences occur, it can either prevent those systems from developing or they may get very much delayed. Let me give an example, which will be familiar to everybody today. When COVID occurred in its kind of core period for those 2 years, 2020 to 2022, what it effectively did to everyone was create social isolation. But where it damaged the population the worst was the teenagers. Teenagers need social interactions the way babies need milk. And so that period of development is a kind of a sensitive period of development where children need social interactions. And what COVID did was deprive them of that completely. Our youngest daughter had to come home from college during her first year, and she had a year and a half of very limited social interaction. And for those who think that social media and FaceTime replaces it, it does not. And so what we're seeing now in schools, I'm sure every educator listening today will know, and parents too, is we're seeing, relatively speaking, socially immature children. They're chronologically 13 and 14, but socially they're 9, 10, 11. So it really deprived them of core needs. So it's very important when we think about adversity to link it to key developmental periods because things like language, social thinking, emotion, decision making, all those things have different windows where experiences are going to fuel them. So the second T is timing. The third T is tenure. How long does it last? And again, remember the acronym, right? Adverse childhood experience. The experience is never defined. If I have a father, let's say, who's incarcerated for a month, that is certainly very adverse. But if my father goes off into lockup for 10 years, that's a very different period of loss. And we want to take that into account because that's going to also affect the period of stress that child is undergoing. Are they living in constant poverty throughout childhood? Or is it, let's say, during COVID, where many parents and families were hurt because people couldn't work? And so their finances may have gone way down. And that was a period of loss of resources, but it was maybe stopped after 2 years. That's horrible and was painful to many, many children and families, but it ended maybe for some. So the third is tenure. The fourth is what I call turbulence. And turbulence refers to kind of the controllability or predictability of the adversity. And that's a really important one. I mean, they're all important, but it's important because we all know that when we are confronted with adversity, the lack of control over it is what is often so stressful to us as any human being. When you move homes, for many, that's one of the most stressful periods of your life. Where is everything? I got no control. Are the carpenters going to finish this? The electrician, and super anxiety ridden because we have no control over the situation. For children living, let's say, with great neglect and lacking resources, they have no control over that. They have no predictability. Where are they going to live? When's the next meal going to come? or if they've got, let's say, an abusive father who is alcoholic, who may come home at night and beat them. They have no control over that and no predictability of when that's going to occur. So that sense of control and ability to manage it is going to add on to the nature of that adversity. And then the last T is toxicity. How severe is it? So again, we know that socioeconomic scale, the level of neglect or deprivation a child experiences is going to affect how that frontal system develops, how severe the sexual abuse or emotional abuse is going to affect the nature of how toxic it is to the developing body and brain. So to put it together, we've got five different types of adversity. Five dimensions: type, timing, tenure, turbulence, and toxicity. And those shape potentially the nature of the response, which can be either traumatic or resilient.
So, especially a child that's very, very young, maybe at that birth stage, undergoing a lot of trauma, who hasn't developed any sense of resiliency, would respond much differently than maybe a 14 or 15-year-old that's, even if they have more ACEs, they might have the ability to cope with it or deal with it in some way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think some of the best evidence we have that I review in the book comes in some ways from these really dark, sort of sad periods in the history of Romania, where children were abandoned to what were called institutions. I mean, they were orphanages, but they were these austere, in the Shame of the Nation 1990s documentary, they were kind of considered Nazi concentration camps for little kids. So they're just bleak. And that was a high toxicity level of deprivation for those children. But one of the things that we've learned from these extraordinary scientists, developmental scientists who study these children since the 1990s and they've been able to follow them, is that children who were placed in good foster care homes by the age of about 2.5 years of age were more likely to recover all the key cognitive, social, and emotional functions, as opposed to children who were either lived in the orphanages until they were late teens or were placed after that period. And so that suggests a key developmental window where the first few years of life are absolutely fundamental for developing that frontal lobe system. And if you don't get that experience early enough, the window kind of closes down and you now see significant delays, which show up as learning deficits, mental health problems, and so forth. And so there's like consequences later in life. So that really pinpoints those first early years as being critical to the development of the executive system. When you think about the different types, abuse creates a very different traumatic signature. So, one of the ideas in the book that I think is really important for anyone working with children who have experienced adversity is to think about this idea of traumatic signatures. That rather than use the umbrella term trauma, which to me doesn't help us understand what happened to the child and how it manifests, think about the idea of a signature. So, with deprivation or neglect, we see the failure of these frontal lobes to thrive. And those are kind of at the root of all learning and decision making. Individuals with better executive functions do better in school, they have better social relationships, are more healthy, are wealthier later in life, and so forth. Abuse creates a very different signature. It basically puts the system of the brain that's involved in emotional processing on high alert. These are children who are constantly vigilant because, of course, what they've been living with is an unsafe, threatening world. One of the examples that I tell in my book was one of the first classrooms I walked into, middle school children. I walk in, this little boy runs right out of the room. And I had no idea what happened. The teacher came up to me and said, "Look, I'm really sorry, but you actually look very much like his father who beats him almost every night." So for this little boy, I was just the trigger that launched an escape response, which from his perspective is exactly the right response because he's like a gazelle on the savannah in Africa. When a lion approaches, the conclusion isn't that lion is bad, but all lions are bad. So he has generalized correctly. And of course, what school needs to do, and what I ended up helping them do, is remove that generalization. rather than conclude that all men are bad because my dad was bad. We have to kind of desensitize or undo that generalization so that he can calm down. So, for example, next time I came into the classroom, I sat on the floor. So now I'm smaller than he is. And I looked away from him. So I'm not threatening in any way. And eventually, sort of charmingly, he came up to me and goes, "Hey, what? You're not going to talk to me?" And so now begins the healing of that unsafe environment. So for children with abuse, in particular, maybe physical abuse, sexual abuse, but even emotional abuse, they're on high alert because the world feels unsafe. And now we've got to calm down that nervous system, which is feeling unsafe.
As these children grow up, and your book is very much focused on the child, and I absolutely appreciate that. A lot of the books are, people as adults, but they do become adults, and some of these strategies of working with their signatures is vital. But if this doesn't happen and they move into society, which I imagine the majority of this is happening, I mean, how do we as a society help these kids that are now adults function in society? I mean, it just seems like very overwhelming.
It is overwhelming, and of course, it's devastatingly sad because many adults are living with the horror of the childhood adversity they experienced, and of course, what sort of makes it doubly bad for these individuals is that often the trauma they're living with carries forward in terms of their own children and their own families. And so this is this kind of idea of intergenerational trauma, which has been in some ways misinterpreted by many as kind of coded in the genes, and that's not the case. Although there are, I describe as kind of epigenetic effects, which is the expression of the genes can be affected. But potentially more importantly and more relevantly, which is why interventions early with mothers and fathers who experience adversity is so important, is because they may be completely unaware of the kind of parenting they're exhibiting because they're just doing what their parents did to them. And so either neglect or abuse, they're just kind of following what they learned as a parenting strategy. And so they may not even be aware of what's going on. The other piece of this is we now know quite a bit about how, for example, exposure to war, as it's happening in Gaza and Ukraine, what it effectively does, one thing that it does, is it deadens the empathy system. So if I'm a mother or father with no empathy, then I'm not going to recognize the core cues of need for my children. And so they're in some ways blind to the needs of their children because that system has been deadened. So when it comes to adults, of course, change is harder because the brain's less plastic, less able to change. But there's hope. And part of what I discuss in the book are some of the relatively newish technologies that are coming on board now to help with adult traumatic experiences. So I'll just mention two. These kind of fall under the topic I call neuroengineering, which can sound a little scary. And to some extent it is because it's a maybe much more direct, invasive way. But one involves this technique, which has now been approved by the FDA for depression, called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And basically, it's a magnetic coil that's put to your skull. And it's kind of like a clicking motion. It doesn't feel really that bad. But effectively, what it does when it's repeated is it effectively takes out a certain circuitry of the brain temporarily. So it's kind of what people call a reversible lesion, unlike a fixed lesion where you have a brain damage which takes out the circuit completely. This kind of takes that temporarily. What I find hopeful about this technology is there's one particular study that I think I should describe in the book where we take individuals who have had traumatic experience, these are adults, where the trauma itself is linked to very, very powerful and overwhelming visual imagery. Veterans of war, somebody seeing a loved one killed in a car accident, where the visuals just completely overwhelm the system. So whenever they are in some ways triggered by a memory of that experience, the visuals are just flooding them. And so it becomes impossible to manage daily functioning, becoming in sleep, and even during the daytime. So what you do is with this transcranial magnetic stimulation is you apply it to an area well known to be involved in visual imagery, and you have these individuals call the imagery back up. And while they're doing it, you're hitting that visual imagery area. The result is they don't forget the experience, but the visual imagery is effectively erased, is deadened. So now when they remember what they lost or what they experienced as in a veteran of war, they're not flooded by that visual imagery. So that's one technique. Very hopeful for that kind of approach. The second, which many, of course, your listeners may be aware of, but has really advanced tremendously over the last decade, is therapy assisted psychedelic treatment. And here, the work has really advanced. Many of your listeners may have read Michael Pollan's wonderful book that, in some ways, celebrated the scientific work on psychedelics. That work has advanced even in the last 5, 6, 7 years due to extraordinary scientific work. And I'll just point to one, in part because it's beautiful science. So, this is work that was done with MDMA for long term sufferers of PTSD, often complex PTSD, typically associated with dissociation, massive emotional dysregulation, and so forth. The reason why this is important is because, in part, your question, which is adults who really are suffering from these experiences. Now, not all the PTSD sufferers were due to childhood adversity, but the symptomology, of course, is that they have these very, very difficult to manage mental health issues. The patients in the study, importantly, were what were called treatment resistant, meaning that typical treatments like therapy, different kinds of therapy, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, along with medication, Prozac, SSRI, different kinds of SSRIs, had not worked for a minimum of 10 to 13, 14 years. So these are people who've been just suffering for a long, long time. Okay. They take an 8-week course of therapy assisted MDMA treatment. Now, again, importantly here, it's not just therapy and it's not just the psychedelic, it's the combination. This is critical. And what you find at the end of this 8-week course is about 70% of these individuals lose the PTSD diagnosis. That is a mind blowing result. Now, lots of unknowns. We don't know how long it's going to last. But the key idea is that the psychedelic has modified the brain circuitry, which we're understanding more and more about, opening the individual to a kind of therapy that they had it not been for that psychedelic treatment. Similar kinds of results for major depression. So the key is that the impact of the psychedelics and what it does to the circuitry of the brain is be understood at a key neural function level so that the therapy can effectively guide what's going on with that individual. So there's still many unknowns. What kinds of population, the diversity of the population, how long it will last? Will they need continued psychedelic treatment with therapy? A lot of unknowns. But the hope there is massive. Now, of course, that's only for adults. That is not yet ready for prime time for kids. And of course, we're a long way off. But those kinds of methodologies are coming online now. I think they hold great hope for both adults and hopefully one day children.
Yeah, I love seeing that door open, the psychedelic door open for therapy. Now, I just want to go back to what you had mentioned about the ACEs and policy and the dangerous policies that may have come out of the ACEs research. Could you give us an example of that and what that looks like?
So I think it starts in the following way. I mean, we have a penchant for things that seem simple, and the ACE score was a simple one. There are posters, what's your ACE score? It's easy, we can score, and there we have it. But what's happened is the ACE score has now entered into insurance policy for treatment. And so, for example, in California, Medi-Cal, which is for low income individuals, there's now a code for your ACE score, 4 and above and below 4. And there are different codes for those ACE scores. There are several problems with that, a couple we've already alluded to. But let me start with the most important one. The ACE questionnaire, when it was developed and how it's used today, was never intended as a score for an individual. It's a population measure. And yet, that's how it's being used. That, Catie, your ACE score is 2 and mine is 6, and therefore I'm in a worse condition than you're going to be because my ACE score is higher than yours. That's not how it was ever intended. It's like saying my heritability score. Heritability is a population measure. It's not an individual measure.
So problem number one is that it was never intended for the individual. Problem number two, we already alluded to. That's the experience. It's not the response to the experience. So we're using a measure of experience as opposed to the health response. We don't have that. Third is that the ACE questionnaire was given to adults retrospectively talking about what they experienced as children. And we now know from dozens of studies that there are poor records of what actually happened. So, for those three reasons, I think it's extremely dangerous to be having the ACE score as a measure that's going to fuel policy. And the fourth I would add to it is you've got these other dimensions of adversity that I've mentioned: timing, toxicity, turbulence, and tenure, which all impact how you respond. That, of course, makes it more complicated than the ACE score. We now have a much more complicated measure, but we also need to tie it to the response because that's the health condition. And so I think the ACE score is having a disproportionate impact on how we think about policy, but also how we think about helping children recover and build resilience to adversity. So I think in a short sense, that's my worry, is that it has done a good job of alerting people to the potential impact of adverse childhood experiences, but the score has taken on a disproportionate life in terms of how we think about helping people.
So people with the higher score are going to get more resources, essentially. And then the people with lesser scores, we just kind of throw them back in the general population and say, deal with it. All right. So in terms of what are some of the main barriers to maybe the wider acceptance of the use of these therapies, and how can that really be addressed?
The good thing is there are a lot of strategies for building resilience and recovery that are not as invasive, so to speak, as the magnetic stimulation and the psychedelics. And many are being used, for example, in schools. So, for example, just to give one example, biofeedback is a no cost, readily available method. And one of the ways in which this is tied to kind of the science is the longest nerve in our body, the vagal nerve, which controls kind of the heart and heart rate. There's a critical way in which, when we're in a calm state, there's a high frequency of the heartbeat, which is much more variable interbeat. So the duration of time in between the beats at the high frequency of our heartbeat is much more variable. When we're stressed and closed off to the social world, it's actually a much more consistent interval between the beats. But you can shape that through certain kinds of breathing to increase that high frequency heart rate variability through biofeedback. And that has been shown, for example, to be effective, for example, in autism, where the social nature of the disability can be actually shaped up through this form of biofeedback of breathing. So again, that's a low cost method, which can be readily implemented when individuals are feeling overwhelmed and stressed by the environment. Let's say that little boy I talked about who ran out of the room, calming that nervous system down. So that's one example. There are other methods bringing greater body or somatic awareness to the individual. In the vast majority of children that I work with, I'll be talking to them and they have no idea that their fists are clenched, that they're flush in the face, no awareness. And so simple body scans where they have a little checklist where they can go through and say, my legs are bouncing, my hands are fidgeting, my palms are sweating, my eyes are darting. Just bringing greater awareness to that can then be a step in the direction of that kind of healing. And then, of course, when it comes to the neglect piece, where those frontal functions are being kind of undermined, strategies to gain greater attentional focus, help work on short term memory, greater self regulation, tons of different techniques that are low cost that are, in some cases, being used in schools. The key is that the educators, the nurses, the social workers need to be aware of these different signatures. So it's not this kind of one stop shopping for trauma. That, I think, is one of the greatest mistakes in bringing education to the population of professionals, help shape those different interventions.
How do you deal with the stories that you hear? Because, I mean, you're working with children, you're seeing a lot. I mean, how are you able to cope with the stories that you hear?
So that's a really good and important question, because I think one of the things I discuss in the book is how do you create trauma-informed organizations? And part of that is these kind of 4 Rs: realizing that traumatic experiences are common, recognizing these traumatic signatures, building kind of the resilience for the trauma, and then resisting re-traumatizing individuals who may have had their own experience of trauma. So for myself, it's having outlets and supports in my environment, my wife and my children, my friends and sports, and having other ways of dealing with that. And it's finding ways to kind of be aware of my own body response. I mean, so I'm involved with extraordinarily sad cases of children who are living in very, very difficult conditions. For me, what propels it and I think buoys me above it is seeing the hopefulness of it and seeing children be able to kind of surmount it. And so one of those stories in my book that I end with is a child that I met 3 years ago in an orphanage in Kenya, who arrived effectively emaciated and mute at the age of 4.5. We were just back at that orphanage just a month ago. This little boy is bright-eyed, talking, healthy, reading, speaking 2 languages. So I keep those in my mind very powerfully, because as you kind of started out with, when you hear 1 billion children maltreated, it's like climate change. Like, I just give up, I quit. But I have so many personal cases that keep the passion to do this and to help children and to share it with others. I mean, so I think that's what ultimately buoys me to keep moving, is having support systems at home and in my world that allow me to stay healthy, and seeing the hope in children's eyes that I work with, that there can be hope down the road.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all this with us, Dr. Hauser. This has been amazing.
You're welcome, Catie. Good. Happy to have the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Beyond the Medical Algorithm is brought to you by the Philly Wellness Center. To find out more about the Philly Wellness Center and how we're challenging conventional medical wisdom and shedding light on more natural means of healing and therapy, visit phillywellnesscenter.com. And then make sure to search for Holistic Health in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at the Philly Wellness Center, keep celebrating the innate power in our incredible bodies, and thanks for listening.